So here in this video lecture, we're going to look at the origins of capitalism. And the question arises, of course, with the fact that you have then an entire class of people that did not exist before that own capital, that are then able to employ workers. So where did that capital come from? For Marx, this is the question of primitive accumulation. And specifically then, there's a certain secret about primitive accumulation which he wants to highlight. Now, he says the movement of capitalism seems circular. So the accumulation of capital presupposes profit, or as he refers to it, surplus value, right? The money that is gained when you have sold a good, the revenue you've gotten from the sold good pays for the supplies needed to make the good and pays for the labor needed to produce the good, and all the money that's left over, that's the surplus value or the profit. Now, the thing about this is that profit presupposes capitalist production, so like the division of labor, for example. And this is something that Adam Smith says, that the accumulation of stock must precede the division of labor, right? In the Wealth of Nations, you must have capital before you can have the division of labor. Now, the requirements of the division of labor actually then presupposes, so it then requires this, which is the availability of masses of capital and labor power in the hands of commodity producers. So you need then people that have access to this capital. So you need capital to create the division of labor, which creates profit. Now, where then did this capital accumulation prior to, of course, the emergence of capitalism come from? So in some way, he doesn't mean Marx doesn't mean that this kind of accumulation of capital is primitive and that it's like, caveman-like or whatever. But he uses the term primitive accumulation to denote the fact that it's a kind of accumulation that really is actually prior to the efficiency of the capitalist system. And in that way, then, that kind of pre-capitalist accumulation of capital or just general stock is primitive, because it doesn't afford itself to the kind of efficiency in terms of the production of goods, in terms of the ability to exponentially create profit, and so on. Now, Marx finds that the primitive accumulation of capitalism plays approximately the same role in political economy. So in the study, the classical study of economics, or specifically right then of capitalism and the emergence of capitalism, that this primitive accumulation plays the same role as original sin does in theology. And this might seem like a very odd claim, right? Here we're talking about economics, the emergence of capitalism, how people are employed, how profit is created, which of course is the sole purpose of business and capitalism. The question, though, is one, where did this accumulation of capital come from? But two, if everybody actually really does know it, why is it this kind of secret? And when he says secret, it's a secret that, again, everybody actually knows, but they tell a story that covers over it. And so it's treated as if a secret that nobody really does know. And now, he likens this to theology because, as he says here on 873, the primitive accumulation plays approximately the same role in political economy as the original sin does in theology. Adam, in the Bible here, Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. So, of course, the origin of sin comes from the biting of the apple in the Garden of Eden. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote about the past. Long, long ago, there were two sorts of people. So this then has to do with the origins of capitalism, the story, at least that's told. One of those sorts of people are the diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals spending their substance and more in riotous living. So you have one group of people that are just much better at taking care of themselves, maybe growing things, selling things, and another group of people who kind of just are lazy, just want to have fun, maybe, right, and aren't that attuned to not even maybe just their bare subsistence, but living a life well lived. So he says, the legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow, right? So the biting of the apple, having to toil. But the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Now, the story, part of it actually comes from, for example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the Second Discourse concerning the origins of inequality, and this idea that there had to have been this natural split between people, some who, ended up the haves and haves not, right? Some who ended up being more productive, others who maybe were dealt by terrible natural circumstances like a flood that ruined their crops, or others, again, that were lazy or foolish or whatever else, right? And that part of this explains, then, at least the very beginning of the inequality among people. Now, this story is told in classical economics here, as Marx is talking about. But what's interesting is, in at least theology with original sin, all are condemned to toil, at least, right? This is what's claimed, that it's essential to humankind. Now, of course, in the origins of capitalism and this story, not all are actually condemned to toil. Those who own capital are not. He says, never mind, right? As if, that's glossed over by those who tell this story. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, those who were better at working, more diligent, and the latter sort, those who were lazy and so on, finally had nothing to sell except their own skins, right? Their own labor power or labor time. And from this, original sin dates the poverty of the great majority who, despite all their labor, have up to now nothing to sell but themselves, and have the wealth of the few that increases constantly, although they have long ceased to work. So, what we get is this story that the reason why there is inequality, and therefore the reason why capitalism was able to exist, whereby some were able to accrue this stock, right, that is necessary to create the division of labor, is that some just worked harder and others did not. Now, there's a secret behind this, the story that's hidden, but that everybody actually really knows. They just gloss over it, kind of sweep it under the rug, so to speak. This is the secret of primitive accumulation. It is that this capital that was required to introduce the division of labor was had by conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, and other kinds of force. And who could doubt this? Anyone that studies, of course, world history would learn, well, you had this period known as colonialism, where these wealthy individuals financed, or governments financed, expeditions to the old world, to the new world, which pillaged and murdered, of course, scores of people, and brought back a lot of wealth home. Now, this actually, when you read the history of capitalism, is one of the chief explanations for the emergence of capitalism. It was the merchant class that arose out of the colonial expeditions. The problem with this is that it says, well, there wasn't deserved merit, right? Think about like Aristotle, and this idea that justice comes from deserved merit. Well, in that case, simply, if wealth is accrued through colonial activity, then that doesn't just simply, at least morally, justify, the rewarded deserts that come from colonial expeditions, for example. So here what we can see then in primitive accumulation is that first, the creation of capitalist profit can only take place under particular circumstances. So if the secret is that actually murder, exploitation, and slavery, for example, was required to accrue the capital necessary to introduce the division of labor, we know that then in the implementation of the division of labor, profit that is made in the capitalist system can only take place under particular circumstances, where there is a complete separation between the workers and the owners of the means of production. So you have then those that have accumulated the capital, and then those that employ workers to work according to a certain division of labor. That's how a profit is created. Now, this, of course, means that primitive accumulation, then, is the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. Because the question then arises, where did these workers come from? So if we know the secret is the fact that this was due to murder and exploitation and theft and whatever else, which we know from, just colonial and imperialist history, what about all the workers that are needed, for example, in the factories? Where did they come from? And the argument that Marx gives is that you needed then to divorce a whole class of people from the means of production, the ability, the capacity, the tools required and needed to produce their own subsistence, right, to survive day after day. So Marx, with his being influenced by Hegel's dialectic here, although turning it into a materialist dialectic, argues that the economic structure of capitalist society then grew out of the economic structure of feudal society. If we want to know where workers come from, we need to look at what was the previous epoch, the previous way in which society organized itself economically. So he says, hence the historical movement, which changes the producers into wage laborers, appears, on the one hand, as their emancipation from serfdom and from the fetters of the guilds. And it is this aspect of the movement which alone exists for our bourgeois historians. And those bourgeois historians are the political economists. But on the other hand, he says, these newly freed men became sellers of themselves, so right, of their labor power and labor time, only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production and all the guarantees of existence afforded by the old feudal arrangements. And this history, the history of expropriation, is written in the annals of mankind in the letters of blood and fire. Right, so that's kind of one of those mic drop moments right there, again from Marx. Now, there's something peculiar about what he's arguing here. He's saying, on the one hand, with the destruction and the overthrow of feudalism, scores of people, an entire class, right, serfs, are free. They're no longer bound to the land. They're no longer bound to serve lords. On the other hand, what this also means, though, and here's the the double-edged sword, so to speak, of emancipation from serfdom. They are politically free, but they are now no longer economically free. They are free in another sense. They are free from the means of production. Because in serfdom, although a serf had to was bound to the land and had to work and gather crops for the lord, they still had they were still self-sufficient, and that they still owned the land. They still owned the tools with which they used to cultivate crops. What had to happen then was that they were then, in a sense, freed from the land, freed from the ability to be self-sufficient. So there's two ways then in which they were freed. One in a good way, one in perhaps not so much a good way, although of course it was necessary to create capitalism, to create profit. So Marx gives us a history of the expropriation of the agricultural population from the land that occurred with the breakdown of the feudal order. So what happened first was that in the late 16th and 17th centuries, peasants and serfs, right, were forcibly driven from the land to compete with cheaper wool prices out of Flanders. So Flanders was a region of what's now known as modern-day Netherlands. So you have cheaper wool prices. What this means is that certain larger landowners couldn't compete with the cheaper wool prices out of Flanders, so they illegally force off some peasants off the land to take more of the land that peasants had to use for wool cultivation. They have more wool, then of course they can flood the market with their wool, lowering and outcompeting then those competitors coming out of Flanders. Now then you have the enclosures of land followed by enclosures of state and church lands. So specifically what you had was public land that was taken and church land that was taken and enclosed. So basically fences were put up and said no longer then is this in some way communal land, but this was now going to be land of a private individual. So perhaps one who owned 10 acres, now they seize the church lands and they own perhaps 20 acres or whatever else. So you had church and crown estates then that were forcibly seized by emerging oligarchs, by emerging merchant classes and farming capitalist classes. Now they were not yet though capitalists, although they were now in the transition from being kind of lords of land that had peasants work the land to being capitalists that have workers work the means of production. Now, what followed from this was the abolition of feudal rights. Once you had lands that were seized by wealthier groups of individuals, well, they had all this land. Obviously, one person, if they go from, let's say, owning 10 acres to 20 acres, that person can't just then work the 20 acres like they were able to work the 10 acres or whatever else. They need other people to work that land. So what happens then is that the government of England abolishes feudal rights, right? So this is where serfs are emancipated and they no longer are tied to the land. And instead, what is replaced is private property rights. This is required then. You need a certain legal system that's required for capitalism to exist. You can't really have a reliable system of people, let's say, owning businesses if they don't have a guarantee that their businesses are protected by vandals or other things like that by the state. So you need private property rights. You need the state to enforce claims to private property. Now, by about 1750, so the middle of the 18th century, the yeomanry, which were a group of peasants, completely disappeared, with their land ending up being controlled by a few lords. These eventually transition into capitalists, and what happens is, where it used to be the case that you had this kind of common land, let's say like the woods, for example, where anyone could go into the woods, they need some firewood, they go into it, they chop down a tree, they take it home, right? Everybody kind of is able to survive, right, off this common land. Well, all of the commons end up being enclosed and sold to private individuals. Once the private individuals start fencing up that land, well, it's no longer possible for an individual to survive by just going out and hunting, by just going out and picking berries, by just going out and cutting down some trees, because now all of those things are owned by private individuals. So what this does is it forces then, now that serfs have been emancipated from being tied to the land, but on the other hand, then they're denied the ability to fend for themselves. And this is something really important. I mean, think back in what you learn in early American history classes. What was understood by freedom by people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, especially the Jeffersonian Republicans, right, is that to be free, you needed to own land. It was only if you owned land that you were truly free, because then you were not subject to have to work for anyone else for your own survival. Now think about that. On the one hand, then, you have the serfs being freed from the land, and this is a good thing. On the other hand, though, if that land is then bought up by someone who's wealthier, and then all the land over time is eventually bought up by a minority of people, then you have a whole class of people now that can no longer survive by themselves, and they have to go and sell their labor to someone else who is able to employ them. So for Marx, it's really the enclosure of the commons, and therefore the use of the state to expropriate land from peasants that makes possible capitalism. That's what creates then an entire class of workers. So I want to read from him about this enclosure of the commons here. So Marx says, communal property, which is entirely distinct from the state property we have just been considering, was an old Teutonic institution which lived on under the cover of feudalism. We have seen how its forcible usurpation, generally accompanied by the turning of arable into pasture land, begins at the end of the 15th century and extends into the 16th. But at that time the process was carried on by means of individual acts of violence against which legislation for 150 years fought in vain. So at some point the state actually did try to stop the forcible seizure of land by oligarchs. It didn't succeed, though. The advance made by the 18th century shows itself in this, that the law itself now becomes then the instrument by which the people's land is stolen, although the big farmers made use of their little independent methods as well. So at one point in time, the state tries to stop emerging oligarchs from seizing land. Eventually, though, when the oligarchs become too powerful, they use their wealth as power to then influence the state in passing laws which then benefit themselves against the peasant classes. So he says the parliamentary form of the robbery that is that of bills for enclosure of commons, for example. In other words, decrees by which the landowners grant themselves the people's land as private property. Decrees of expropriation of the people. Sir F. M. Eden refutes his own crafty special pleading, in which he tries to represent communal property as the private property of the great landlords who have taken the place of the feudal lords, when he himself demands a general act of parliament for the enclosure of commons, thereby admitting that a parliamentary coup d'etat is necessary for their transformation into private property, and moreover calls on the legislature to indemnify the expropriated poor. Now, of course, we can ask, then, how does it benefit the capitalists that the state comes in and starts passing new laws? How does it benefit the capitalists that an entire class of people were taken from their land? It means, then, their only way to survive is to turn towards those who now possess sizable amounts of capital. Those that now have accrued enough wealth to build factories, that now have accrued enough land that they need to hire others to work the land. So an entire class transitions from being tied to the land and being, kind of petty agriculturers to now being a working class. So here we have then the genesis of capitalism. We have the accumulation of capital and then the creation of a working class, which makes possible then the division of labor and the creation of profit. Now, we originally had two kinds of capitalists that emerged. The capitalist farmer, those who employed peasants to work the enclosed land, and then the industrial capitalists. These employed freed serfs in factories. So how then did industrial capitalists get their capital compared to the farmers, where, of course, they are just enclosed the land? Industrial capitalists accumulated capital from usury, so this would be giving out loans but charging interest, where, of course, then they can generate profit, or from merchant practices that was brought on by colonialism in the New and Old Worlds. And what would happen is merchants oftentimes would actually bet. They would bet on whether ships would arrive with goods and make it through that long journey around the globe. If they came back, they make a bunch of money. If they don't, they lose some money, right? So there were some winners and there were some losers. It was through these merchant practices, though, the buying and selling of goods and the betting on goods from market, that this class grew. So, of course, if then you have people that, some of the merchants did, of course, become capitalist farmers. Perhaps they bought land, but a lot of them did not own land. Instead, they were used to the buying and selling of goods. So they build factories, right? They are centered around towns, and this is why they were able to build factories then in towns. Now, again, I think it's really important, it can't be overstated the way in which then the state played a central role in the genesis of capitalism. Because it is a kind of myth that, admittedly we do get from like Adam Smith, and it's perpetuated, that capitalism really is this free market system that emerged by the government kind of stepping back and letting just natural processes of business and market transactions create profit, right, and increase overall well-being. To some extent, of course, this is true. Certain practices did arise wherein markets were a bit more free. But the shaping of those markets, though, the shaping of the forms in which those free transactions could occur, that had to have been done by the state. That required the passing of laws about private property. That required the state legitimating the expropriation of land, for example. The creation of an entire working class. Marx says, these methods of primitive accumulation then depend in part on brute force, for instance, the colonial system, right? And the colonial system was enforced and protected by the state. But they all employ then the power of the state, all of these forms, the concentrated and organized force of society to hasten, as in a hothouse, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society which is pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. Now this is undoubtedly true. I mean, if you look at something like, let's say, the emergence of the Soviet Union, you could not have had the transition to capitalism that occurred in the 20th century. You could not have had the rise of industrialism in Russia without the use of the state to abolish serfdom, without the use of the state to create a working class, to consolidate capital and create property rights and so on. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, there weren't atrocities that were committed in the Soviet Union. There were. Force was used. But that also doesn't mean there weren't atrocities that were created in the United States, for example. I mean, think about the clearing of land of Native Americans by the state. The state had to do that to free up land. The state had to, give incentives to people to move out west, to occupy land. The state had to endorse the creation of railroads and facilitate that creation, and so on. All of these things which were necessary for the rise of capitalism in the United States, for example. And all of those things caused harm. So one thing it's, again, really important to take away from this is the state has always had a crucial relationship with the emergence and the maintenance of capitalism. Now, according to Marx, this was not merely a historical accident, right? The emergence of capitalism. That there's a certain historical tendency of capitalist accumulation. So first he says that the private property of the worker in his means of production, the private property of the worker in his means of production is a necessary condition for the individuality of the worker themselves. That it is common to have, of course, petty laborers, right? Or we could call them peasants, right? That have access to a certain amount of land and that can provide their own subsistence. There's a contradiction that arises out of all this, right? And this is essential to Marx, that there are internal contradictions to everything. Everything is contradictory. That wherein the possession of the means of production by everyone in a more primitive society allows everyone to be self-sufficient and therefore more free, that also then is the seed of its own downfall. So a contradiction exists in the early parts of history where you had everyone owning the means of production. He says, this mode of production presupposes the fragmentation of holdings and the dispersal of the other means of production. As it excludes the concentration of these means of production, so it also excludes cooperation, division of labor within each sphere, separate process of production, the social control and regulation of the forces of nature, and the free development of the productive forces of society. It is compatible only with a system of production and a society moving within narrow limits which are of natural origin. So to perpetuate this earlier kind of system would be, as Epicurus says, to decree universal mediocrity. At a certain stage of its development, it brings it into the world the material means of its own destruction. That through everyone, like peasants, for example, owning the means of production, right, just a small amount, and being able to provide for themselves, they're in a way doing a kind of even more primitive form of primitive accumulation. One which if you look at the practices that are incurred, shows that, hey, if you had a little bit better technology, hey, maybe if you divide up your practices in the labor you perform, you could produce more of the goods, you could produce them more efficiently, you could then sell them and make overall more money, increase the value of your goods. All these things, of course, is what capitalism does, and they're all contained within the essence of what then labor of the means of production provides. Now that means then there is a more rational process of which to approach the means of production, which means capitalism is the logical progression out of this stage of everyone owning the means of production. So centralization then of capitals leads to the imminent laws of capitalist production itself. Marx says, what is now to be expropriated then is not the self-employed worker, but the capitalist who exploits a large number of workers. So again, where each worker could create, let's say, a car over a long period of time, if then you have one person who owns the materials and the tools needed to create the cars, and then a bunch of people that don't own that but then can perform labor that's divided up to create cars, you can create more cars over time, making more money. Now, of course, what this means is you can only do it through exploitation, where you deny the workers the full value of their labor. So, for example, what this means then is that let's say it cost, these numbers are going to be a bit ridiculous, but let's say it cost the capitalist $10 to buy the machines necessary to create a car. Let's say then they employ 2 people, each $10 an hour, and let's say it takes 1 hour to create one car, of which then they sell for $100. So they sell $100. They owe. They had to make at least $10 to pay back the money that was needed to purchase the machine in the first place. Okay, done. $90 are left. Well, then they had to pay $10 to each person to work the machine to create the car. Okay, that's $20 total. That means $70 is left out of the $100. All of that is then surplus value. All of that is profit. And that all goes into the hands of the capitalist. Even though it was through the labor of the individuals, where they, in having, needing to, let's say, pay back the $10 for the machine to be used to create the car, those workers together created $90 then worth of value. But they're each only given $10. So if you were to split it, right, then each would be given $45. So each then is actually denied an additional $35. That is how profit is created. Now, what that means, so again, is through then exploiting workers, you're able to create profit. And that is, in a sense, right, that's the efficiency of capitalism. That is how you create more products, how you're able to sell more goods for cheaper. Additionally, according to Marx, the capitalist mode of production, just as a kind of universalist ownership of the means of production by every individual, bears the seeds of its own destruction in the movement to capitalism, so too, according to Marx, does capitalism contain within it its own seeds of destruction. So he says, the capitalist mode of appropriation, which springs from the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual private property, as founded on the labor of its proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a natural process, its own negation. This is the negation of the negation. It does not reestablish private property, but it does indeed establish individual private property on the basis of the achievements of the capitalist era, namely cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production produced by labor itself. So wherein capitalism then took from a majority of people individual private property and now said only a minority of people own private property, well, then the next logical extension is that those means of production that are created in capitalism can be owned by everyone else to create profit, right? That's Marx's argument, influenced by the dialectical process.